Banker's daughter lost everything in the fire. The stable boy she once ignored now owned half the county. The flames reached the sky like greedy fingers that night, painting Morrison Falls in shades of hell. Eleanor Whitmore stood in her silk nightgown on the lawn of what had been the finest mansion in 3 counties, watching 20 years of privilege turn to ash. The fire had started in her father's study, they said, though no one could say how. Papers first, then curtains, then the carved mahogany desk where Henry Whitmore had foreclosed on half the valley. Now the house roared like a living thing, eating itself from the inside out, and all Eleanor could do was watch. Behind her, servants ran with buckets that might as well have been thimbles. Her father shouted orders no one followed anymore. Her mother had fainted on the grass. Her perfect composure finally cracked, like the windows exploding in the heat. But Eleanor just stood there barefoot on the October ground, watching her world end. She didn't see the figure watching from the shadows of the stable, didn't know that someone else was counting the cost of this night in currencies that had nothing to do with money. By morning, nothing remained but blackened timber and stone foundations. The fire had been thorough, deliberate almost in its destruction. The bank records, gone. The gold in the safe, melted to slag. The bonds and certificates that proved ownership of a dozen farms, ash on the wind. Henry Whitmore sat in the dirt like a broken doll, trying to understand how a man could go from king to pauper between sunset and dawn. His wife wept into her hands, mourning gowns and jewels and the portrait of her grandmother that had hung in the parlor for 40 years. But Eleanor walked through the ruins with strange calm, her silk gown now grey with ash, her feet black with soot, looking for something she couldn't name. That's when she found it, in what had been the kitchen garden. A single rose blooming impossibly red among the destruction. She knelt beside it, touched its petals, and remembered another morning, 5 years ago, when she'd been 17 and cruel with the casual power of beauty and wealth. The stable boy, what had been his name? James? John? Had offered her a rose from this same bush. She'd laughed, told him stable boys shouldn't dream of things they couldn't afford, had watched his face close like a door, seen something die in his dark eyes. She'd forgotten him by lunch, but now, holding this survivor of flame, she remembered the careful way he'd held that flower, like it was worth more than gold. The creditors came like vultures to carrion. Without the bank's records, without proof of assets, Henry Whitmore was just another man with debts and no way to pay them. The other banks, jealous rivals for years, showed no mercy. The very laws Henry had used to build his empire now stripped it away piece by piece. The servants left first, wages unpaid and unpayable, then the horses sold for pennies, then the land itself, auctioned to the highest bidder. Within a month, the Whitmores were living in the pastor's charity house, 2 rooms and a leaking roof, dependent on the same people Henry had foreclosed on without blinking. Eleanor took work at the hotel, scrubbing floors and changing linens for travelers who didn't look at her face. Her hands, soft from years of rosewater and French creams, cracked and bled in the lye soap. Her back ached from bending, her knees bruised from kneeling, but she didn't complain. Something in her had broken free the night of the fire, some understanding that the world was bigger than ballrooms and calling cards. She worked in silence, listened to the talk of travelers and townspeople, began to understand how her father's empire had really been built, on suffering, on families thrown from their homes, on children going hungry so Henry Whitmore could have Italian marble in his foyer. Spring came late that year, but when it did, Eleanor noticed things she'd never seen before. The way wildflowers grew in the cracks of boardwalks, how sparrows built nests from scraps and string, the patience of grass, always returning no matter how many boots trampled it down. She was hanging wash behind the hotel when she saw him, the man on the black horse, riding through town like he owned the air itself. Good clothes, but worn like work clothes. Good boots, but dusty from real travel. And when he turned his head, she knew those eyes. Dark like river stones after rain. The stable boy who'd offered her a rose, but Jonas McKenna wasn't a stable boy anymore. The talk in the hotel kitchen told the story in whispers and wonder. How he'd left Morrison Falls 5 years back with nothing but a horse and bitter determination. How he'd hired on with a cattle drive to Kansas, saved the trail boss's life in a stampede. How that grateful man had been childless and rich, had taken Jonas as the son he'd never had. How Jonas had learned the cattle business like a man starving for knowledge, had made his own fortune in rails and beef and land. How he'd come back to Morrison Falls and bought up half the county, piece by piece, including every property Henry Whitmore had lost. Eleanor's hands stilled on the wet sheet. She waited for him to recognize her, to say something cutting about how the mighty had fallen. But Jonas rode past without a glance, and somehow that was worse than any words. She wasn't even worth his notice anymore. That night, she lay on her narrow cot in the charity house, listening to her mother cry and her father pace, and thought about roses and chances and the price of casual cruelty. Pride, she realized, was a luxury she could no longer afford, but perhaps humility was a gift she'd never known she needed. The next morning, she walked to the McKenna ranch at dawn. It sprawled across land that had belonged to 3 families her father had foreclosed on, their small farms now part of something bigger, but somehow kinder. She could see the changes already, new wells being dug, fences mended, a schoolhouse rising where the old Jameson place had been. Jonas was in the north pasture working alongside his men to repair a fence. He saw her coming across the field, this girl in a patched dress who'd once worn silk, and his hands stilled on the wire. She stopped 10 feet away, close enough to speak, far enough to run if needed. The morning sun made long shadows between them. "I need work," she said simply. No pleasantries. No reminder of what they'd been to each other. Just the bare truth. Jonas studied her, those dark eyes giving away nothing. His men had stopped working, watching this play out like a drama on a distant stage. "You know anything about work?" he asked finally. "I'm learning," she replied. He nodded slowly, went back to the fence. "Kitchen needs help. 6 in the morning, 7 days a week, $1 a day and meals. You miss a day, you're gone. No favors for anyone." She lifted her chin. "I don't want favors." He almost smiled then, just a quirk of his mouth. "No," he said. "I don't suppose you do anymore." She started the next day, in the kitchen of the house Jonas had built where the old McKenna shack had stood. It was fine but not fancy. Solid wood and good stone, built to last rather than impress. The kitchen was run by Maria Santos, whose family had worked the land for 50 years before Henry Whitmore decided they were in his way. Maria looked at Eleanor with eyes that knew too much, then handed her an apron. "You know how to peel potatoes?" she asked. Eleanor didn't, but she said yes anyway. She'd learn. She'd learned harder things already. The work was brutal. Up before dawn to start the stoves, cooking for 30 ranch hands who ate like wolves, washing dishes until her hands went numb, scrubbing floors until her knees felt like broken glass. Maria didn't make it easier, but she didn't make it harder either. She taught with few words and many demonstrations. How to stretch a pound of flour into bread for dozens. How to make meat tender when it was tough. How to know by smell when the bread was ready, by sound when the coffee was right. Eleanor learned it all with the same focus she'd once applied to French and watercolors, but now the knowledge felt real, felt necessary, felt like something no fire could burn away. Jonas she saw rarely. He ate with his men, worked alongside them, treated her with the same distant courtesy he showed the other kitchen staff, but sometimes she caught him watching her, something unreadable in those dark eyes. Once, when she was hauling water from the well, he appeared and took the buckets without a word, carried them to the kitchen, then disappeared again. Another time she found a pair of good work gloves on her usual bench. No note, no explanation. She wore them until they wore through, then mended them and wore them still. Summer blazed across the valley, and Eleanor discovered muscles she'd never known existed. Her hands grew strong, her back straight in a different way than dancing masters had taught. She learned to read the weather in cloud formations, to know the moods of the kitchen cat, to predict which ranch hand would complain about the biscuits and which would eat anything set before him. She learned their names, their stories, where they'd come from and what they'd lost. Many had worked for families her father had destroyed. Now they worked for Jonas, and the difference was written in their faces. Men with dignity restored, with futures possible again. One evening in August, a storm rolled in fast and violent. Eleanor was closing the kitchen shutters when she saw a rider racing ahead of the wind, Jonas bringing in a calf across his saddle. Lightning split the sky as he reached the barn, and she found herself running to help before she could think why. Together they got the calf into shelter, its mother lowing anxiously outside. Jonas's shirt was soaked through, his face streaked with rain and dirt. The calf was tangled in wire, bleeding from a dozen cuts. Without speaking, they worked to free it, Eleanor holding it still while Jonas cut the wire away. Thunder shook the barn walls. Rain hammered the roof like bullets, but inside there was just the calf's labored breathing and their hands working together. When it was done, the calf struggling to its feet to find its mother, they stood there in the barn's shelter, both soaked, both breathing hard. "Thank you," Jonas said quietly. Eleanor pushed wet hair from her face. "It needed doing," she replied. He looked at her then, really looked, like he was seeing past the patched dress and work-worn hands to something else. "You've changed," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she answered. Then, because the storm made honesty easier, "I was cruel to you. Before I'm sorry." The words hung between them like the lightning illuminating the barn in flashes. Jonas was quiet for a long moment. "We were different people then," he said finally, "both of us." They walked back through the rain together, not touching but not far apart either. At the kitchen door, Jonas stopped. "My mother planted roses here," he said, gesturing to a bare patch of earth. "Before, when this was home the first time. She loved red ones, said they meant courage." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "I remember roses," she said softly. He nodded like that meant something, then disappeared into the storm. The next morning she found a package on her bench. Rose seeds, wrapped in brown paper. No note, but she knew. She planted them that evening, hands deep in earth that had seen too much loss, whispering promises to seeds about what might grow from ashes. Fall came with its harvest urgency. The ranch bustled with activity. Cattle drives prepared, crops brought in, winter supplies laid by. Eleanor had been there 6 months now, had found rhythm in the work, purpose in the exhaustion. Her parents still lived in the charity house, her father a ghost of himself, her mother fading like evening light. Eleanor brought them food when she could, money when she had it, but they barely recognized this daughter, who smelled of kitchen smoke and spoke of weather patterns. She grieved for them, but couldn't return to what they needed her to be. That girl had burned with the house. The roses bloomed in October, impossible late, brilliant red against the kitchen wall. Eleanor was gathering the last blooms before frost, when Jonas appeared. He did that sometimes now, showed up wherever she was working, helped without being asked. They'd developed a language without words, a nod that meant the coffee was ready, a gesture that said rain was coming, a almost smile that could mean anything or nothing. He looked at the roses, then at her hands holding them. "My mother would have liked you," he said unexpectedly. "This you, the real you." Eleanor felt tears threaten, blinked them back. "How do you know this is real?" she asked. "Maybe I'm just playing another part." He shook his head. "No, I've seen you pretend. This isn't that." Winter arrived early and hard. The first blizzard caught everyone off guard, including a group of travelers whose wagon broke down on the North Road. Jonas led the rescue party, Eleanor and Maria preparing the house for survivors. They brought back a family of 5. The children blue with cold, the parents barely conscious. Eleanor worked through the night, warming bodies and souls with soup and blankets, and the fierce determination that no one would die on her watch. One of the children, a girl about 6, wouldn't stop shivering even next to the fire. Eleanor held her, rocked her, sang half-remembered lullabies until the child finally slept. When she looked up, Jonas was watching from the doorway, something soft and wondering in his face. The family stayed a week until the roads cleared. The morning they left, the father took Eleanor's hands. "We heard about the Whitmores," he said quietly. "Heard they lost everything. But lady, I think you found something better." After they'd gone, Eleanor stood in the kitchen, thinking about loss and finding, about the girl who'd worn silk and the woman who wore aprons. Maria found her there, handed her a cup of coffee. "You know he's in love with you," Maria said bluntly. "Has been since you showed up asking for work. Maybe before." Eleanor's hands trembled on the cup. "I don't deserve it," she said. Maria snorted. "Deserve's got nothing to do with love. Love comes anyway. Question is what you do with it." That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor walked to the barn. The horses dozed in their stalls, breath steaming in the cold. She found Jonas there, as somehow she'd known she would, mending harness by lantern light. They'd taken to meeting like this, accidental on purpose encounters where they could talk without the weight of daylight watching. She sat on a hay bale, watched his hands work leather with the same patience he brought to everything. "I hated you," she said suddenly. "When you bought the land, when you succeeded. I thought you were rubbing my face in it." He looked up, surprised. "That wasn't why," he said. "Then why?" she asked. He set down the harness, rubbed his face. His hands, she noticed, were scarred from work, capable and real. "Because someone had to," he said finally. "The land was dying in pieces, families scattered. I thought maybe I could put it back together different, better, make something that lasted, something that helped folks instead of hurt them." He paused, looked at her directly. "And maybe because part of me wanted to prove that stable boy wrong, the one who thought a rich girl's rejection meant he was nothing. Turns out he was wrong about a lot of things." Eleanor felt her heart crack open, flooding with something that felt like spring water after drought. We were both wrong, she whispered, about everything that mattered. Christmas came with snow and singing. The ranch hands decorated the main house with pine boughs and holly. Maria made feast enough for an army. Eleanor had saved for months to buy small gifts for everyone, nothing fancy, just tokens that said she'd noticed them. A new knife for Tom, who was always losing his. Wool socks for Ben, whose feet were always cold. A book of poetry for young David, who thought no one knew he wrote verses in the margins of feed ledgers. When she gave Jonas his gift, new work gloves to replace the ones he'd given her, now mended past mending, he held them like they were made of gold. That night, after the feast, when the hands were singing carols off-key and Maria was teaching the younger men to dance, Jonas found Eleanor on the porch. Snow fell soft as whispers. The world was clean and white and full of possibility. "I have something for you," he said, pulling a small box from his pocket. Inside was a ring, simple silver set with a single small ruby. Nothing fancy, nothing like the jewels her mother had worn. But Eleanor knew without asking it had been his mother's, knew what it cost him to offer it. She looked from the ring to his face. This man who'd risen from nothing, who'd built something good from the ashes of others' greed, who'd shown her that worth had nothing to do with wealth, that strength could look like kindness, that love could grow in the ruins of pride. Yes, she said, not to the ring but to all of it. The work, the life, the man who'd waited for her to become herself. When he kissed her, it tasted like redemption. They married in spring, when the roses were budding. A simple ceremony in the ranch's garden, Maria as witness and the hands as congregation. Eleanor wore a dress she'd made herself, carried roses from the bush she'd planted. Her parents didn't come, her father too lost in his ghosts, her mother too bitter to see blessing in what looked like further fall. But the family that gathered was real, bound by choice and work and mutual respect rather than blood or money. Jonas had built more than a ranch. He'd built a community, and Eleanor had found more than work. She'd found herself. The years that followed were rich in ways that had nothing to do with banks. They raised children who knew the value of both hard work and kindness, who could read Latin and rope cattle, who understood that every person deserved dignity, whether they owned land or worked it. The ranch grew, but differently than Henry Whitmore's empire had grown. It grew like a garden, with room for everyone to flourish. Jonas started a bank of his own, one that lent to help rather than harm, that saw people as more than numbers on a ledger. Eleanor ran the school they built, teaching letters to children who would have gone without, showing them worlds beyond the valley while teaching them to value the world they had. Sometimes, on summer evenings when the work was done and the children were playing in the yard, Eleanor would remember that other life, the silk dresses and dancing lessons, the casual cruelty of privilege, the girl who'd laughed at a stable boy's rose. But the memory no longer hurt. It was like looking at a photograph of a stranger, someone she'd known once but didn't miss. This life, hands in soil, heart in community, love built on truth rather than pretense, this was real in a way that Mansion never had been. The fire had destroyed everything she'd thought she was. In the ashes she'd discovered everything she could be. When Henry Whitmore died, 10 years after the fire, Eleanor stood at his grave with dry eyes. Her mother had passed the year before, never reconciling to her daughter's choices, but Eleanor grieved them both, not for who they'd been, but for who they might have been if they'd known what she'd learned, that loss could be gift, that humbling could be freedom, that sometimes the only way to find yourself was to lose everything else first. She left roses on their graves, red for courage, and went home to the life she'd built from nothing but will and work, and the strange mercy of a stable boy who'd become so much more. Jonas was waiting on the porch, their children playing in the garden, where roses bloomed every summer without fail. He stood when he saw her, crossed to meet her, took her hand without words. They stood together, looking out over land that thrived with careful tending, at the community they'd built from the ruins of greed. "I used to dream about burning it all down," Jonas said quietly, "after you laughed at me. Used to imagine the whole valley in flames." Eleanor squeezed his hand, understanding. "But you built instead," she said. "We built," he corrected, "from the ashes up." Their eldest daughter, Rose, came running from the garden, her dark hair flying behind her like a banner. At 15, she had Jonas's steady gaze and Eleanor's quick mind, but something entirely her own too, a fierce sense of justice that made her argue with anyone who said things had to be the way they'd always been. "Papa," she said breathlessly, "the Hendersons' well has gone dry. Their crops are failing. Can we help?" Jonas looked at Eleanor, that silent communication of long-married couples. "Of course," Eleanor said. Take Samuel and Mary with you. Show them how neighbors help neighbors." Rose grinned, already running to find her younger siblings. "That's our real wealth," Jonas said softly, watching her go. "Children who know how to see need and meet it." The ranch had become more than either of them had imagined. What started as Jonas buying back foreclosed land had transformed into something revolutionary for its time, a cooperative where families owned shares in the whole rather than competing for pieces. The old Whitmore Bank building, rebuilt after the fire, now housed a different kind of financial institution. The Mutual Aid Society, Eleanor called it, where families pooled resources for emergencies, where loans were decided by community vote, where profit was measured in stability rather than silver. Henry Whitmore would have called it madness. The 100 families who'd found security through it called it salvation. But change never comes easy, and there were those who resented what Jonas and Eleanor had built. Theodore Garrison, who'd made his fortune buying desperate land cheap and selling it dear, saw the cooperative as a threat to the natural order. He'd arrived in Morrison Falls 5 years after the fire, drawn by opportunity and others' misfortune, and had built his own empire on the old model: squeeze the poor, court the rich, and never let conscience interfere with profit. He despised Jonas for succeeding without cruelty, Eleanor for thriving outside her proper place, and both of them for proving his philosophy wrong. The confrontation came, as such things do, over water rights. The summer of their 20th anniversary was the driest anyone could remember. Streams ran low, wells failed, and Garrison saw opportunity. He'd bought the land upstream years before, and now he built dams, diverted water to his own holdings, and offered to sell it back at prices that would bankrupt half the valley. The old way would have been violence, men with guns settling disputes with blood. But Jonas had learned different lessons. He called a meeting not of landowners but of everyone, farmers and ranch hands, shopkeepers and schoolteachers, anyone who had stake in the valley's future. Eleanor watched from the side of the meeting hall as her husband stood before the crowd. He'd aged well, she thought, silver threading through the dark hair, lines around his eyes from squinting into sun and smiling at their children. But the steady strength that had drawn her remained, tempered now with wisdom. Garrison sat in the front row, smirking, sure that law and precedent stood with him. He owned the water. He could do as he pleased. That was the way of property, the way of power. But Jonas didn't speak of law. He spoke of community, of interdependence, of the truth that in a drought, everyone thirsted together, or everyone survived together. The solution came from unexpected quarters. Young David, the ranch hand who wrote poetry, had been studying law by correspondence. He'd found precedents in Spanish colonial grants, documents predating American law, that established water as common heritage rather than private property. Maria Santos, now in her 70s but sharp as ever, produced papers her grandfather had saved, proving historical usage rights that Garrison's dams violated. And Rose, barely 16, but already formidable, had organized the young people to document every stream, every traditional watering place, creating maps that showed how Garrison's diversions broke patterns centuries old. The legal battle took 2 years. Garrison hired lawyers from San Francisco, men in fine suits who spoke of progress and property rights. Jonas and Eleanor mortgaged everything they'd built, trusting the community to stand with them as they'd stood with others. The courtroom in the county seat became a battlefield of philosophies, the old way of individual power against the new vision of collective strength. Eleanor testified about her father's methods, the human cost of treating people as numbers. Jonas spoke of building something better from the ashes of the old. But it was Rose who perhaps made the strongest impression, speaking with passion about the future they were choosing, not just for themselves, but for generations unborn. When the verdict came down in their favor, establishing water as community resource rather than private property, Garrison left Morrison Falls within a month. His empire, built on the old model of exploitation, couldn't survive in a place where people had learned to stand together. The dams came down in a celebration that lasted 3 days, water flowing free again to fields that had waited 2 years for relief. That night in their bedroom, Eleanor found Jonas sitting by the window, tears on his face. "We did it," he said. "We really changed things, not just for us, but for everyone who comes after." She held him then, this man who'd started as a stable boy with nothing but determination, who'd become not a baron like her father, but something better, a builder of communities, a creator of possibilities. Their children grew into the legacy their parents had built. Rose became a lawyer, the first woman admitted to the bar in 3 counties, fighting for water rights and workers' dignity with the same fire she'd shown at 16. Samuel, quiet like his father, revolutionized farming methods, teaching sustainable practices that kept soil rich and families fed without depleting the land. Mary, the youngest, inherited Eleanor's gift for teaching, but took it further, establishing schools for immigrant children, insisting that education belonged to everyone regardless of origin or income. Each of them married partners who shared their values, raising another generation in the understanding that privilege meant responsibility to lift others. The silver anniversary celebration filled the ranch with faces from across the valley. In the garden where roses bloomed impossibly red, tables groaned under food grown on land that Henry Whitmore had stolen, and Jonas had returned. Eleanor moved through the crowd in a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself, accepting congratulations, sharing memories, but always returning to Jonas's side. Maria Santos, ancient now but still fierce, raised a toast. To the stable boy who dared to love above his station, she said, her voice carrying across the gathering, and to the banker's daughter who learned to love beneath hers, may we all fall so far and rise so high. That night, after the guests had gone and the children had bedded down their own children in rooms throughout the house, Eleanor and Jonas walked their land. The moon was full, turning the world silver and shadow. They stopped at the hill overlooking the valley, where lights from 100 homes sparkled like earthbound stars. Each light represented a family secured, a future possible, a small victory over the old way of doing things. Helena thought of her father, dead now 20 years, wondered if he ever understood in his final days that his empire had been built on sand, while Jonas had built on stone. "I never thanked you properly," she said suddenly, "for taking me on that first day, for seeing who I could be when I couldn't see it myself." Jonas turned to her, his face serious in the moonlight. "You thanked me every day," he said, "every time you chose to stay, every time you got up before dawn to feed 30 hungry men, every time you stood beside me when it would have been easier to leave. That's the thanks that matters, the daily choosing, the quiet staying, the building something together that neither of us could have built alone." They were quiet for a while, comfortable in the silence of long partnership. Then Eleanor spoke again. "Do you remember what you said that night in the barn, during the storm, that we were different people than we'd been?" Jonas nodded. "I think about that sometimes," she continued. "How the girl who laughed at your rose and the boy who offered it, they had to die for us to be born. How grateful I am that they did, because I couldn't have loved that boy properly, and he couldn't have loved that girl truly. But you and me, who we became, we fit, we match. Not perfect, but real." Jonas pulled her close, this woman who'd been debutante and scullery maid, who'd learned to birth calves and balance ledgers, who'd stood before judges and faced down powerful men, who'd raised children to be warriors for justice wrapped in kindness. "You know what I think," he said. "I think that boy with the rose saw who you really were, even under all that silken pride. And maybe that girl who laughed, maybe she recognized something in him that scared her, something that called to what she could be. Maybe we were always going to find each other. It just took a fire to burn away everything that wasn't true." The years continued their steady march. Jonas's hair went white, Eleanor's hands grew gnarled with arthritis, but they worked still, teaching the next generation what they'd learned. When the valley faced new challenges, the railroad wanting to cut through productive farmland, mining companies eyeing the hills, the structures they'd built held strong. The Mutual Aid Society had grown into a network spanning 3 states. The schools Eleanor had started produced doctors and teachers, engineers and artists, children of field workers who went on to change laws and minds. The cooperative model spread, proof that another way was possible. Rose argued cases before the state Supreme Court, her children playing in the same gardens, where she'd learned that justice wasn't abstract but personal. Samuel's innovations in farming were studied at universities, his methods saving topsoil across the West. Mary's schools became the model for inclusive education, her textbooks teaching history from multiple perspectives. And always at every family gathering, the story was told again. How grandfather had been a stable boy, how grandmother had been a banker's daughter, how they'd found each other in the ashes of the old world and built something new. Jonas died in his 80th year peacefully, in the bed they'd shared for 55 years. His last words were for Eleanor. "Thank you for seeing me, all of me, always." She held his hand as he passed. This man who'd given her not wealth but worth, not comfort but purpose, not a life of ease, but a life of meaning. The funeral drew thousands. people whose lives had been touched by his quiet revolution, his insistence that power should lift rather than crush. Eleanor spoke at the service, her voice still strong at 78. He was a stable boy who dared to dream of more, she said. Not more for himself, but more for everyone. He taught us that revolution doesn't always come with guns and manifestos. Sometimes it comes with patient building, with daily choosing to be better than the world expects. Eleanor lived another 5 years, long enough to see women win the vote, to see their grandchildren take up the work, to see the valley their love had transformed become a beacon for others seeking different ways to live. She spent her last years teaching still, her arthritis-twisted hands guiding young fingers in forming letters, her voice sharing stories of times when the world was smaller and meaner, and how ordinary people had chosen to make it bigger and kinder. She died in the garden among the roses on a morning in late spring when the whole world seemed to bloom at once. They buried her beside Jonas, and if you visit that grave today, you'll find it always decorated with fresh flowers. Roses, yes, but also wildflowers picked by children who know the story, left by families who understand that they walk free because two people chose love over pride, community over isolation, building over burning. The house still stands, expanded now into a museum and community center, but at its heart the original kitchen where Eleanor learned to work, the barn where they saved the calf together, the garden where roses bloom impossible red every summer without fail. The McKenna Whitmore Foundation, run by their great-grandchildren, continues the work, funding schools, supporting cooperatives, fighting for justice in boardrooms instead of streets. But the real legacy isn't in institutions or endowments. It's in the understanding, passed down through generations and spreading still, that every cruel system is made of people and can be remade by people choosing differently, that a stable boy's rose can be more valuable than a banker's gold, that sometimes the greatest gift is losing everything, because only then can you discover what's truly worth having. And they say on October nights when wind carries hints of smoke and memory, if you stand in that garden where Jonas and Eleanor built their life from ashes, you can feel it still, the warmth of a love that transformed not just two people, but an entire valley. The courage it takes to change, to grow, to become more than what the world told you to be. The beauty of finding someone who sees not who you were, but who you could be, and chooses to build that future with you, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one rose at a time. Because in the end, that's what their story teaches, that love isn't just feeling but doing, isn't just passion but patience, isn't just romance but revolution, that the best marriages aren't between perfect people, but between those willing to perfect each other, to sand down rough edges with gentle friction, to see in each other not just what is but what could be. That sometimes a stable boy and a banker's daughter can rewrite the rules of the world, not through force but through the simple, radical act of choosing each other again and again, until choosing becomes changing, and changing becomes legacy, and legacy becomes the gift we leave for those who come after. A world where roses grow from ashes, where love bridges chasms, where every ending is just another beginning if we're brave enough to build it together.